We meet on holy ground, for that place is holy where lives touch, love moves, memories emerge. We meet on holy ground brought into being as life counters life, as one life history blends into our common story. When a child is born, when a life is ended, we kindle a flame in this chalice to mark the transitions of life and death and all that happens in between. We mark this time as sacred, for we meet together on this day on holy ground. May our souls capture this treasured time, and may our spirits celebrate our meeting in this time and this space for this sacred purpose. We gather together this day to mourn the death of and to celebrate the life of Kenneth Elwyn Ford. And today, through the sharing of stories, through the healing power of music, through our tears and our laughter, we will bring Ken close to us once again. In the eulogy for Eleanor Roosevelt, Adlai Stevenson once wrote, "We are always saying goodbye to this world, always standing on the edge of loss, attempting to retrieve some meaning from the silence left behind." We are here to share a few of those memories and stories, and by this simple yet complex act, we begin the slow work of changing our relationship to him. Although we do not claim to know what happens to us after we die, we do know this, that death comes to us all. And we also know that each of us will, at some point in our own lives, face grief. There are some things we know about grief. There is no one way to grieve. We ask that you be gentle with yourselves and with one another, for we each grieve in our own way. We also know that when we lose someone we love, it brings back every other loss we've suffered. And though each of us may need time to grieve in our own ways, we also need to return again and again to the community of friends and the embrace of family. Today, we gather at this common well of loss to hold each other and this family in our care and to be reminded that life is indeed a precious and fragile gift. So we hold that knowing now for just a moment of silence, knowing that silence can be a balm for a wounded or weary spirit. May it be so. Where do we go when we grieve? We turn to one another, we turn to music, we turn to poetry. And this responsive reading, found in number 490 in the Gray Hymnal, is called Wild Geese by Mary Oliver. Your part is in italics. You do not have to be good. You only have to let the soft animal of your body love what it loves. Meanwhile, the world goes on. Meanwhile, the wild geese, high in the clean blue air, are heading home again. Geese, harsh. Please join me in hymn 108, My Life Flows On.
Liesl Mueller's Monet refuses the operation. Doctor, you say there are no halos on the street lamps in Paris, and that what I see is an aberration brought by old age and affliction. I tell you, it has taken me all my life to arrive at a vision of gas lamps as angels, to soften and blur and finally banish the edges you regret I don't see. To learn that the line I call the horizon does not exist, and sky and water so long apart are the same state of being. 54 years before I could see Rouen Cathedral is built of parallel shafts of sun. And now you want to restore my youthful errors, fixed notions of top and bottom, the illusion of three-dimensional space, wisteria separate from the bridge it covers. What can I say to convince you? The Houses of Parliament dissolve night after night to become the fluid dream of the Thames. I'll not return to a universe of objects that don't know each other, as if islands were not the lost children of one great continent. The world is flux, and light becomes what it touches, becomes water, lilies on water, above and below water, becomes lilac and mauve and yellow and white and blue cerulean lamps, small fists passing sunlight so quickly to one another it would take a streaming hair from my brush to catch it. To paint the speed of light. Our weighted shapes, these verticals, burn to mix with air and change our bones, our skin, our clothes to gases. Doctor, if only you could see how heaven pulls earth into its arms and how infinitely the heart expands to claim this world, blue vapor without end. Not two, Dad. One.
Kenneth Elwyn Ford was born in 1940 to Wesley and Grace Ford in Sacramento, California. His father was a minister serving a Disciples of Christ congregation. Ken and his sister Jean were raised with fairly rigid gender roles and expectations and instilled with values of justice-seeking, diligence, and of course, religious community. As a youth, Ken was a good student, staying mostly out of trouble, except for that one New Year's Eve when he and his 15-year-old buddies set off a bunch of firecrackers outside a monastery in the hills of Pasadena. Ken played piano and organ from a young age, playing in his father's church, and indeed, almost any church he came across over the years, sometimes pulling the car over on family road trips to see if the place was open and organ turned on, then settling in to give it a go, much to the amusement and embarrassment of his kids. Now, when Ken was 15, something happened to him that would change his life. He was attending a pajama breakfast at the Idlewild church camp. Ken was wearing his black and white striped pajamas, and sitting across from him, an interesting and attractive teenager wearing red and white stripes. Barbara was her name, and she too was a preacher's kid. A teenage long-distance romance ensued with letters written back and forth between Burbank and Pasadena. But Ken broke off this budding relationship after getting a speeding ticket driving through Glendale to go on a date, saying he couldn't risk losing his driver's license. Fortunately, Ken and Barbara struck up again when attending Chapman College together, and were married for 63 years. Ken's musical talent led him to study sacred music at Union Theological Seminary in New York. And while there, living in the married student dormitories with Barbara, Ken became active in social justice work. Now, this was during the time of the communist scare, and Ken was lined up with other Union students outside the Interfaith Center on Riverside Drive in New York, with guys from the Russian Orthodox Church in their robes on the other side, all singing, "In Christ there is no East or West." Ken had registered as a conscientious objector and actively engaged and challenged others on issues of human rights. In 1963, he and Barbara joined in the March on Washington for Racial Justice and then answered the call from Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. for people to support the Voting Rights Act in 1965, leading a group of students to Montgomery. They were kicked out of a diner when the manager realized why they were there. Ken, an outspoken advocate of racial equality and justice, was even denied a music position he had applied for at a church because of his views. But he eventually landed a position at a church in Lincoln, Nebraska, where Barbara began attending a Unitarian church. Ken felt that music might not be a solid enough career to raise a family. So he studied architecture at the University of Nebraska at Lincoln, where he and Barbara welcomed Ben in 1964 and Sarah in 1967. He later studied urban planning at the University of Southern California and was a principal planner for the city of St. Paul for 28 years, far beyond the initial 2-year commitment he and Barbara had made to weather Minnesota winters. Architecture and city planning were a good complement to his other role of leading music for worship. Ken worked at congregations in California, New York, and of course, he served here as the music director at Unity from 1980 to 1987. Ken had incredible attention to detail and confidence in being able to figure out how to do things, which led him to remodeling 2 of their homes in St. Paul, along with innumerable projects like building kites with his children and a darkroom for Sarah's photography. Halloween presented a unique opportunity for him to be creative. Neighborhood children were known to run in fright away from the decorated house, and his Dutch elm disease costume is infamous. Just imagine. After retiring from St. Paul's city planning in 1999, Ken continued serving the municipality through engagement with the Nonviolent Peace Force and through the St. Paul Interfaith Network, volunteering extensively with the Healing Minnesota Stories Project. He identified many images with harmful or incomplete narratives about indigenous and settler history when renovating the Capitol building. And he was deeply dedicated to telling honest stories about Minnesota's indigenous past. Ken's work with communities was distinguished by careful listening, respect for community processes, thoughtfulness, and relating city policy to the deeper well-being of city residents' lives. Ken was a deep thinker who at times would retreat into his own thoughts, catching up later in the conversation, having worked something through. His innate attention to detail and diligence was at times exacting, and he eventually gave up his music directing and organ playing, unable to reach the bar of perfection that he set for himself. The final decades of Ken's life were largely devoted to the study and practice and teaching of Zen Buddhism. He studied first with Katagiri Roshi at the Minnesota Zen Meditation Center, later moving his primary practice to Clouds in Water in St. Paul. So with us today, to join in the celebration of Ken's life, is Reverend Mio O, a dear friend and Dharma sister of Kyo Ken Ford, Zen teacher at Clouds in Water Zen Center, and at Hokyoji Zen Practice Community, where Ken was very active. So it is my pleasure to invite the Reverend to share with us some words about Ken Ford and his Zen practice.
I have known Ken since he came to practice with Dainin Katagiri Roshi, who was the Zen master, Japanese Zen master, who founded the Minnesota Zen Meditation Center. But in the last 15 years or so, we have both been members of a small interfaith study group. We often met at his house, and we have all become extremely close. It was due to Ken's invitation to me to present at an interfaith Seder many years ago that I was asked to join this very dear group. Ken's connection with Zen began when he was a teenager, after he read The Wisdom of Insecurity, A Message for an Age of Anxiety by Alan Watts. In 1976, he met living Zen in the form of Shoken Weinkauf, who was a psychologist and a senior student of Katagiri Roshi. In the late 1980s, Ken became a devoted student of Katagiri Roshi, or we called him Hojo-san. Katagiri died in 1990, and Ken moved his practice to Clouds in Water, where he eventually was lay ordained as a teacher by Reverend Byakuren Judith Regier, who sadly would like to be here but is taking care of some family illness out of state. Ken's insightful teaching and quiet ways were much appreciated by his Sangha, which means community, and he was beloved for his sincerity and his dedication. Although Zen practice was originally set up for monks who literally left home to spend their lives in a monastic setting, in modern times, most practitioners are householders. The time away from home that the rigor of Zen practice demands caused Ken's family to experience the challenges of his absence. Ken's Dharma name was Keiyu, which means helping to edify wisdom. He was both an ordained lay Zen teacher and a householder. So today, I want to offer a verse, a famous verse from the Diamond Sutra. A few people here know it, and if you wouldn't mind supporting me by chanting it with me, I would be grateful. It didn't make it into the program, or I would have invited everyone to chant it. So I'm going to call out the title of the chant, and we can chant it together 5 times, and then I'll read a dedication. If you want to just kind of hum, that's great also. Ken would love that. Okay. Diamond Sutra. So you should view this fleeting world, a star at dawn, bubble in a stream, a flash of lightning in a summer cloud, flickering lamp, a phantom and a dream. So you should view this fleeting world, star at dawn, a bubble in a stream, a flash of light in a summer cloud, a flickering lamp, a phantom and a dream. So you should view the fleeting world, a star at dawn, a bubble in a stream, flash of lightning in a summer cloud, a flickering lamp, phantom and a dream. So you should view this fleeting world, a star at dawn, bubble in a stream, a flash of lightning in a summer cloud, flickering lamp, a phantom and a dream. So you should view this fleeting world, star at dawn, a bubble in a stream, a flash of light in a summer cloud, a flickering lamp, a phantom and a dream. We dedicate the merit of this chant in support of K.U. Kenford in his journey now undertaken. May he be free to enter nirvana with joy.
Unity Church has a tradition called the Collage of Voices, and it's an opportunity for people to send in brief memories or stories about a person that touched their lives, whom we remember this day. These are some thoughts that are shared for our service. First, from Shodo Spring. In 1988, at my first Hokyoji practice period, we were in the Zendo in formal tea, I think, and Ken offered something that I still remember. I spoke of learning the organ, waiting for a long time to get accepted by a certain organ teacher. He had to have a certain kind of shoes and do things in a certain way. He spoke of learning the organ, waiting for a long time to get accepted. He had to buy certain kind of shoes and do things in a certain way. He had to do everything exactly the way his organ teacher required. And her teaching was so valuable, he said, that she had to wait. There was a long waiting list of people who wanted to be her students. Ken said this in response to someone who was unhappy with the rigidity of Zen forms. I just so remember to this day what he said.
From Steve Harper. I sang with Ken when I first came to Unity. I remember one rehearsal in which he said, "Singing is like Zen meditation. Both of them require total attention to the moment." I have had many occasions since then when I have experienced the truth of that thought.
From Neil Myers. Ken was a gentle, thoughtful, deeply empathic friend with whom I frequently shared rides from Minneapolis to Hokyoji in southern Minnesota for Zen Buddhist retreats. I will miss his gentle spirit, his quiet intelligence, his profound warmth. Though I knew him only at short intervals, he remains a meaningful presence for me.
And Helen Polig says, I participated for some time in the Unity Sangha when Ken was leading it. His calm and soft-spoken presence was such a perfect invitation to meditation. Even now, thinking about him brings a sense of calm to my heart. And from Estelle Brower. Back in 1983, desperate for a new place to do choral music and hungry to learn more about Unitarian Universalism, I landed at Unity Church for a Sunday service. A few lines at the bottom of the back page of the order of worship caught my attention. In essence, all are welcome to come and sing with Unity's choir. Join us any Wednesday night for rehearsal in the parish hall. I showed up the next Wednesday and there was Ken Ford leading this wonderful group of people singing the most incredible music. I was hooked. Thank you, Ken, for welcoming this curious, striving young adult, creating a space for me to build a musical and spiritual home to last a lifetime.
And these words from Stu Alger. I think I met Ken for the first time when I was running for St. Paul City Council, and I knocked on his and Barb's door one early evening. I distinctly remember standing in Ken and Barb's doorway anyway, talking with Ken and Barb and greatly enjoying the conversation. Ken was encouraging, and even though I was probably making a lot of mistakes, my memory is that Ken was friendly and inquisitive, never judgmental. I saw Ken over the years after the election run, and he always greeted me warmly with a smile. I love chatting with Ken, and I'm very sorry to see him go. He will be greatly missed.
And here's my own remembrance. When Sarah and I were kids, Dad was into big presents, often homemade. There was the time my Christmas present was a pile of lumber to make a workbench sized to my 10-year-old self. The real gift, of course, was the time spent with me to design and build it. I still keep some tools in one of the drawers we made for that bench. My favorite memory, though, of this type is when Dad decided to build a dollhouse for Sarah as a gift, and I got to help. I was in on the secret. I got to learn about how to wire up low-voltage switches for lights in all the rooms and see the careful attention to detail that went into every facet. Of course, that detail meant that it wasn't quite done in time for the occasion. We didn't finish the cedar shingle roof until years later, so it's a good thing. Good thing it never had to endure a thunderstorm.
And this remembrance from K.P. Hong. There is an ancient and beloved saying traditionally heard in funeral ceremonies of Zen Buddhist monks and nuns. I went out following the scented grasses, then came back following the falling flowers. Spring arrives and everything is in flower. We throw ourselves into the world, following the scented grasses, wherever the path will take us, grasping after the radiance of summer. But in time, autumn's cool morning dew arrives. We learn to let our breath go, a fleeting, misty cloud into winter's cold, and we return home following the flowers. Years ago, in one of our conversations about Buddhist practice, I offered Ken a film recommendation, a Korean Buddhist film, and really a work of cinematic art called Spring, Summer, Fall, Winter, and Spring. A story about a Buddhist monk passing through the seasons of life on a beautiful lake in an untouched forest. After watching the film, Ken shared this in an email. What happened to the comfortable spring fragrance we sometimes expect our practice to bring to the hard places of any season? Spring, summer, fall, winter, and spring offers no easy out if we are to wake up to what is really going on. The film's intense emotional landscape raises the most fundamental questions. KP continues, for many years, Ken took his seat on Tuesday afternoons, inviting the Sangha to find our seat in whatever the season of our precious and precarious journey, and to reach again and again into our most fundamental questions. Beneath his gentle quiet, we all sense the presence of a spiritual companion and teacher, all too aware of intense emotional landscapes from which there is no easy out if we are to wake up. My deep bow of gratitude to Ken for summoning us to curiosity and courage in claiming our lives entirely, for loving it from that realm of scented grasses to the very last of the falling flowers. For in that boundless realm, we finally know home. Ken's last days were spent in care, in memory care. And earlier this year, after a series of falls, he was blessed to spend the final weeks of his rich life in a care home in Bloomington. And there he had attentive and warm care that touched at times on his memories of life and held him through the fog and fear of those final days. There were even some field trips. In his last weeks, Ken went with other residents on a bus through downtown St. Paul, where he distinctly narrated stories of the buildings they passed, pointing out architecture and historical gems. He even got to the Minnesota State Fair this year. That's right. He was in a wheelchair, up close, smiling, eye to snout, with a sheep less than a week before he died. His final days and hours were in an environment filled with love. And at the end, he was surrounded by his wife, Barbara, and his children, Ben and Sarah, as they sang, "How can I keep from singing?" Indeed, how can we keep from singing?
The interlude listed in your service, Dona Nobis Pacem, you can find that in the gray hymnal. It's number 388, in case you are not familiar with it, although I suspect that many of you are. I invite you to stand as you're willing and able, and we're going to sing it together 3 times. The first time all together, and then the second and third time as a round. And feel free to jump into any part of the round that you would like.
Join me now in prayer. Holy One, source of radiance and reason, we meet in the presence of the great cycle of life and death. For we know this truth: there is no end to old age and death. And yet some part of us wishes it were not so. Some part of us rebels against the reality and finality of death because life is so immutably precious and all too short. People whom we love do die, but they do not leave us. For although so many whom we have loved are no longer among us, we pray that they influence us and abide with us and direct our living towards the worthy purposes they cherished. May we always remember the love they brought to our lives. We meet in the presence of an unfathomable mystery. And so let us enter this time without fear, for love is greater than sorrow. Those who love unselfishly face even the depths with courage. We remember that their strength is the strength of many. Their courage rests on the love of friends. And so must ours rest on the love of friends and companions and ones who hold us and remind us of how important this life is, and for us to consider what legacy we wish to remain. In the presence of life, we say no to death. In the presence of death, we say yes to life. May each of us find the courage and the strength and the hope and the faith to do likewise. Amen. To live in this world, you must be able to do three things: to love what is mortal, to hold it against your bones, knowing your own life depends on it, and when the time comes to let it go, to let it go. Rest well, Ken, in the love we bear you.